All right, good afternoon and welcome to the meeting of the San Diego Metropolitan Transit System Budget Development Committee. I am your chair, Vivian Moreno. Clerk, will you please call the roll?
Good afternoon. Just as a reminder, please turn on your microphones when you are speaking. Moreno,
Present.
Elo Rivera,
Present.
Bobo,
Present.
McCann.
Present.
Chair, we have a quorum.
Thank you, clerk. And moving on to item number 2, which is public comment. Clerk, are there any members of the public wishing to comment?
Yes, we do. Alex Wong.
I know MTS is facing a fiscal cliff, but I urge you to resist cutting service to the busiest lines. During a budget crisis, cutting service should be a last resort. The first thing that should go is capital spending on things like onboard Wi-Fi or fancy station shelters that, while nice, aren't fundamentally what keeps passengers moving. Service does. That's why frequency must be first and foremost. There's capital projects like grade separations and rebuilding the San Ysidro Transit Center. While these are valuable investments that speed up passengers' trips, these aren't as immediately urgent as frequency. On the operational side, there's programs like free U fares. While free fares might be great in theory, Transit Center's 2019 report Who's on Board surveyed transit riders in 7 cities, including Los Angeles, and found that in a reality where transit funding, especially operational funding, is scarce, most riders, including most low-income riders, prefer increased frequency over lower fares. That's why cutting service should be the last resort. And when you cut service to the least busy lines instead of cutting service to the UCSD Superloop, mid-city bus lines, and any of the trolley lines. All these lines are among MTS's busiest. It makes no sense to cut service to these lines. Fiscally speaking, these lines have the lowest subsidies per passenger. Philosophically speaking, transit agencies should serve the most people possible. Therefore, the very last thing MTS should do is cut service on the Blue Line, the route with the highest number of boardings per hour. Such a service cut would negatively impact the most passengers. Let's remember why, even before the Youth Opportunity Pass or the Midcoast Trolley opening, the trolley enjoyed the strongest post-COVID ridership of any American light rail system. Yes, it helps that the trolley's riders are lower income than in most other cities and are therefore more transit dependent as they are unable to telework. But the same can be said for Los Angeles' light rail. What sets the trolley apart from its peers is that it increased off-peak frequency on the busiest corridor, the South Bay Blue Line, on top of fully restoring pre-COVID service, while other light rail systems from Denver to Minneapolis still have less service than they did pre-COVID. The power of frequency is evident even locally, where MTS bus ridership is recovering slower than MTS rail ridership, largely because the bus has suffered from service cuts while the trolley has enjoyed service increases. Once more, frequency is essential to building dense, mixed-use smart growth. Here's a quote from a March 3rd letter that housing groups from across California sent, urging the state legislature to fund transit operations. Without high-quality transit, housing developers will face more pressure to build parking, which significantly increases the cost of construction, making it harder for projects to be economically feasible. The cost of parking is sometimes the difference between building new homes or not. Cuts to transit will exacerbate fears of more traffic congestion, creating a new reason for
30
communities
seconds
to
left.
expect affordable housing. This concludes my comment.
That concludes public comments, Chair.
Thank you. Moving on to item number 3, it's the approval of the minutes from our meeting at April 6, 2026. Clerk, are there any members of the public wishing to comment on item number 3?
We have no public comments.
Thank you. I'm happy to make a motion to move the minutes, if I may have a second.
Second by Goebel.
Second by Goebel. Thank you. I'm going to do a voice vote. And I'm going to start with Council President Shawnila Rivera,
Yes.
Council Member Steve Goebel,
Yes.
and Mayor McCann.
Yes.
And Moreno is a yes, so the motion passes unanimously. Thank you. And we're going to move on to committee discussion, which is item number 4. It's a report from the Executive Director of the California Transit Association, Mr. Michael Pimentel. For the committee, we were supposed to get this very important meeting last month. I'm really excited. There's a lot of things going on in the state. A lot of what we have been asking for is coming to fruition thanks to the work from Sharon and Karen. And so really interested in hearing from Mr. Pimentel. And is he on electronically?
Yes,
He is, okay. And just one of the things for the committee that if we may, I didn't realize that we weren't recording. We weren't video recorded. So when you're listening in, we don't know who's speaking. So if we, obviously it's obvious when I speak because I'm the only woman on this committee, but I think for you guys, if you don't mind just stating your name as soon as you speak. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Mr. Pimentel.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Chair Moreno and Budget Development Committee members. I'm Michael Pimentel, Executive Director of the California Transit Association. We are a nonprofit organization based here in Sacramento, representing before the state legislature 220 member organizations on the advocacy front, including San Diego MTS. Now, I'm going to be sharing my screen. I do want to walk you through very precisely our approach to addressing the transit operations funding crisis and the shortfalls that we have heard about from agencies across the state of California. But before I jump into that, I do want to, of course, acknowledge and thank CEO Sharon Cooney for, one, the invitation to participate, but then also for leading our efforts here at the association. Some of you may know Ms. Cooney serves as a vice chair of our executive committee, and in that role is serving as a chair of our transit operations funding subcommittee. It's through her work, through her guidance, that we've been able to make the tremendous progress that you, Chair Moreno, had noted in your opening remarks. And so as I begin, I do want to provide you all first with an update on the budget development timeline for the fiscal year 23-24 budget. And I do that because the timeline really does anchor the schedule, the calendar that we are operating under in order to move this advocacy effort forward. And so here I want to highlight that the public process for the development of the state budget begins in earnest every year at the start of January. This year was January 10th with the release of the governor's proposed budget. This year, as you have no doubt seen, the governor's proposed budget projects a $22.5 billion budget deficit, which the governor is proposing to balance with a series of cuts, which notably includes a proposed reduction of $2 billion for the Transit and Intercity Rail Capital Program. Now, in the period that we are in today, and that would be from February to May, the legislature is holding a series of topic-specific budget subcommittee hearings. In fact, I participated in one just earlier today that provides the legislature and the public with an opportunity to review and respond to the governor's proposed budget. These subcommittee hearings continue on through the release of the governor's May revise, generally in mid-May. This year, while it's signaled as being May 15th on this calendar, we are getting some early notice that the May revise may be released earlier, possibly as soon as May 10th. Now, in usual years, this document, the May revise, updates the governor's proposed budget to reflect actual tax receipts as reported in April, as well as legislative and stakeholder feedback that was provided in response to the January budget and in the subcommittee process. This year, we're facing some unique circumstances. And that is because due to the extreme weather events that were experienced across the state of California at the start of the year, both the state and the federal governments have extended the tax filing deadline to impacted counties through October. And that does complicate it, I would note, in an unprecedented way, the timeline for the budget development process, because the state will not have a clear picture come the release of the May revise of what it would expect in terms of tax receipts for that next fiscal year. Now, the May revise does also kick off another round of budget subcommittee processes. And I'll just note for you that much of our advocacy effort has been focused at, one, influencing the release of the May revise, and then two, informing the discussion that happens after the release of the May revise as we march toward the adoption of a balanced budget come June 15th, that would be in effect come July 1 for the start of the state's fiscal year 23-24. Now, again, I highlight that because it anchors our approach to this advocacy effort, which I will highlight for you now. Now, our budget advocacy is proceeding in phases. We have long been, starting with the beginning of the year, in phase one. And that phase one is really focused in on building awareness of California Transit Agency's operations funding needs as we were working through our subcommittee process to identify consensus budget requests. Now, in this phase, we have employed a variety of traditional advocacy and public affairs tactics to build broad awareness of the issues that we are facing among legislators, stakeholders, and the general public, and also to create the conditions that would be necessary for receptivity of our budget request, again, as we finalized that request. And I'll go into a bit more details on the specifics of our request in a moment. Now, I want to highlight for you in particular what this issue awareness campaign looked like. It began in earnest in November, really hit its stride at the start of the year, and has carried on through the month of April. And here you'll see that when the January budget was released and we did see the proposed cuts to the TIRCP, we were working closely, I would say hand in hand, with one of our steadfast legislative champions here in Sacramento, that would be Senator Scott Wiener from San Francisco, to respond to the budget and also to engage the press about our concerns with the proposed cuts and to begin to pivot the conversation in the state capitol for the need to provide transit operations funding. Now, we worked alongside Senator Wiener to build out a legislative sign-on letter that pushed back on the governor's proposed cuts, that also did build in that message about the need for new operations funding to be delivered to transit agencies this year over a multi-year period. We also did take to the press, and here you'll see a clipping from an op-ed that I had authored in Capitol Weekly, one of the widely read publications here in the state capitol, that presented on one level a response to the governor's proposed budget, and on another, the case for the state to provide operations funding to transit agencies statewide. Here is also a response letter that we use to formalize that messaging. We have also been very active in raising awareness in public forums. Here you'll see that last year I participated in a public meeting at the California Transportation Commission to begin to preview the requests that we would be delivering to the legislature and the administration in 2023. This year, we've been very active in participating in a variety of budget hearings, both of the full committees as well as their subcommittees. And I've had the great opportunity to participate in a joint hearing of the Senate and Assembly Transportation Committees that focused in on the status of public transit and our budget requests. There I was able to deliver prepared remarks, taking questions alongside the director of the UCLA Institute of Transportation Studies, as well as a CalSTA Chief Deputy Secretary for more than an hour, guiding that conversation through its completion. Now, here I'll just note for you that beyond that participation, we also did participate in a hearing of the Assembly Budget Subcommittee number 3. That committee has jurisdiction over transportation and environmental investments, including for TIRCP, but also the state's cap and trade program. And I'll just signal to you that this year, they actually prioritize our item of transit operations above other items that were included in the governor's budget, recognizing that there was going to be a need to make early progress on this item to ensure that we were in a place to have a deal, hopefully in place by the end of this legislative year. We've also been meeting directly with key legislators, key officials in state government directly to continue to speak to the specifics of our request and to take questions as is appropriate. Now, I also want to highlight for you that all of this work has led to some measurable outcomes for our association for this industry. Here I've highlighted for you a key budget priority document that was released by the Senate last month. That budget document does highlight the need to preserve the funding for the Transit and Intercity Rail Capital Program as we were calling for, and also did show the Senate's commitment to addressing specifically these operations funding needs. And I'm happy to share that just yesterday, the Senate took one step, made one step further, and actually released a budget framework, which further outlined how it is that they would be restoring the governor's proposed cuts to the TIRCP, and that demonstrated a commitment to working with us as an industry, the Assembly, and the administration in addressing the operations funding challenges that we that are currently presented to us. Now, I also want to highlight for you that we've been fairly aggressive in our public affairs efforts. I noted the engagement with the press. We are also active on social media with a paid advertisement campaign that is geofenced around the state capitol to ensure coverage and uptake by legislators and their staff. Today, if you were to see one of these ads and click through to it, it'll lead you to the association's revamped website, where we speak not only to what has driven this operations funding crisis, but then also our proposed solution. And that brings me to conversation on the phase 2 of our campaign. I mentioned that we've been working under phase 1 since really November of 2022, hit our stride at the start of this year. We are now turning the corner onto phase 2, which is focused on building a coordinated statewide advocacy effort. Now that we have a budget request in hand, which we finalized last week and that we submitted to the legislature at the start of this week. Now, I want to signal before I go into the details of that budget request that the rollout of this budget request took the form of the following. One is that we had released a press release alongside Senator Scott Wiener to note the imperative that the legislature address our concerns as detailed in the letter. We participated in a press conference with stakeholders from across the state just yesterday. And then today, as I had noted previously, I participated in a budget subcommittee hearing in the Senate to speak specifically to our budget request, to take questions from senators, again, for more than an hour, to make sure that they felt comfortable with the request that we pursued. And I'll just note for you that the reception from the Senate today was very positive. They acknowledged that within the request, we've been highly responsive to the feedback that the legislature has provided us throughout this past year, that we've offered a reasonable path forward, and that they are interested in continuing to work with us to dial in further some of the details of the request and some of the accountability measures that they would like to see applied to access to those dollars as they begin to flow. And so at this time, I'm going to walk you through specifically the details of our budget request. And then as I conclude, I'm going to touch on a bit on the accountability measures that are no doubt going to be part of this conversation. And of course, you're going to be interested in taking any questions that this committee might have. And so the parameters of our budget requests are the following. The association has formally requested $5.15 billion in transit operations funding over a 5-year, multi-year time horizon. We are asking the legislature for a commitment in this calendar year of 2023, so as to give agencies some certainty around the level of funding that they may receive over that 5-year time horizon. And that $5.15 billion works toward what we have scoped as a $6 billion funding need for agencies statewide. Now, I'll highlight for you that the elements of our association's budget request largely pulls from funding sources that have traditionally supported transit capital and operations. Here you'll see that we are requesting an additional appropriation of revenue from the sales tax on diesel fuel. Here I'll acknowledge that today, California agencies receive roughly 80% of the sales tax on diesel fuel. There's a remaining balance at 20% that goes to the state's general fund. That additional 20% currently has its underlying funding mechanism, this portion of the sales tax on diesel fuel paused. As that goes back into effect in October of 2023, we have asked that the legislature intercept that funding and direct it toward transit operations. Here, that would generate $1.365 billion over 5 years. We've also asked that they direct $500 million a year over the next 5 years for a total of $2.5 billion from the portion of the cap and trade program that is overseen by the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund for transit operations. And here, the case that we're making is that even after you account for the governor's proposed budget and some of the investments that he is proposing to make for zero emission vehicles for disadvantaged communities, there's still a balance of funds that can be directed toward other purposes that reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And here we are making the case that one of the more obvious places to direct that funding would be in public transit, given the nexus that we have not only with reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but also improving air quality and delivering equity benefits to communities across California. Also highlight for you a few additional elements that include some flexibility within funds that traditionally support transit capital. Here, under that first line item of conversion of transit capital funds to transit operations, there is a balance of funds that will be brought online in the out years of fiscal year 26, 27, and 27, 28 that typically would flow through the Transit and Interstate Rail Capital Program. We've requested that a portion of those dollars, and I would note a small fraction of those dollars, be directed toward transit operations, recognizing that for many agencies, the near-term priority will be preservation and expansion of service, and not necessarily the further build-out of capital projects. I also want to highlight that in the governor's proposed budget, as I noted, he has proposed to eliminate $2 billion from the Transit and Intercity Rail Capital Program that were supported through a general fund one-time investment. That one-time investment, as it was approved last year, was for $4 billion total. We're asking that that $2 billion cut be rejected so that we maintain that $4 billion of investment, and that the legislature also authorize us to flex 25% of that restored $4 billion, so $1 billion total over 2 years for transit operations on a regional basis, meaning that regions would have the ability to dictate for themselves how it is that they would invest those dollars between capital and operations, noting that there would be a cap of up to 25% being flexed for operations. I would signal to you clearly that within the San Diego region, the money that is contemplated here for transit capital and potentially operations flows directly to MTS. Now, as I conclude this update, I do want to also then touch on that broader conversation of accountability. And here I want to be clear that the feedback that we've received from the legislature is that unless there is a demonstrated commitment from the transit industry to reform its operations, to implement new accountability metrics, there won't be any new funding provided toward transit operations. So having heard that message clearly, we have incorporated within our budget framework a reference to the work that we are committed to doing to improve transit operations. Here, I do want to signal that of the agency statewide, San Diego MTS has made significant strides to regrow its ridership, to find itself in a situation where you have fiscal stability for quite a few more fiscal years. But nevertheless, we are proposing that we would be supporting some key reform efforts, including AB 761 by the chair of the Transportation Committee, Laura Friedman, that would create a new transit transformation task force that will oversee a broader discussion about the resources, the support, the statutory, regulatory, and administrative relief that is necessary to carry transit agencies forward into the future. Now, I'm going to come back to this in just a moment because I do want to highlight for you one other element that is operative. But here I want to also signal that we are going to be showing our support for additional measures, one being AB 1377, also by Chair Laura Friedman, that relates to access to homelessness funding that is brought online by the state by transit agencies. Here we have acknowledged that transit has a problem with the incidence of homelessness on our systems, on our transit vehicles. Historically, we have not been able to access the dollars that the state has brought online for those purposes. And so what we have requested was initially direct access to those dollars. As that request has been rebuffed, we have asked for coordination between local government entities that receive those dollars and transit agencies to ensure that we are making progress on homelessness as it is experienced on our transit systems. And that bill would compel local governments, as they are applying for and receiving those dollars, to work with transit agencies to demonstrate how their plans at the local level will address homelessness as experienced on our transit systems. And then finally, we'll note for you that we are supporting SB 434, which relates to street harassment as it is experienced on our transit systems, and it provides agencies with new tools for addressing the experience of primarily women, people of color, folks from the LGBTQIA community as they are riding public transit. And now I wanted to come back to AB 761 to note one important thing, and that is previously we've had a lot of discussions within our association with agencies statewide around the concept of TDA reform. And that would be a reform of the broader performance metrics, the accountability metrics that exist in that body of law, and that ultimately govern your access and the uses of the state transit dollars that you receive. Now, at the height of the pandemic, we were able to advance a series of recommendations before the legislature that ultimately became law that addressed many of the interests that we had under that initial TDA reform effort. But here I want to acknowledge that we didn't receive the full balance of the reforms that we would like to see, which include, for example, moving away from fare box recovery as a dominant metric that the state uses to determine whether or not a transit agency is efficient and effective. And so the AB 761 process does contemplate TDA reform more generally. With the legislature's interest in that legislation, they are pulling the responsibility to oversee that effort from the California Transit Association and formalizing it under a new statewide structure. We have commitments from the Assembly and the Senate that as that bill advances, we will still be a prominent stakeholder within it. But because they recognize that this is going to be a much longer term conversation that's going to require input from a variety of stakeholders, they wanted to bring it in under the state's auspices rather than just us at the association. And so conversations will continue on TDA reform, albeit in a different structure and with the guidance and the support from the state of California. Now, finally, I just want to note for you something that's operative here as well, and that is as that AB 761 process gets underway, there is going to be a need for us as an industry to secure an extension of some of the temporary statutory relief that we secured at the height of the pandemic. That statutory relief provided, for example, some waivers or exemptions from the financial penalties associated with noncompliance with the fare box recovery requirements under TDA, the STA efficiency requirements under TDA, and we are pursuing now an extension that would take the current deadline, or rather expiration date of the end of fiscal year 22-23 out toward fiscal year 24-25. That affords us as an industry with additional time to come up with solutions under that AB 761 process, to see that AB 761 process conclude, and to have a smooth transition between a renewed and extended deadline for statutory relief and the start of a new set of performance and accountability metrics under AB 761. Now, I covered a lot of ground today, and without a doubt, there are a number of questions or comments that you might be interested in providing to me. And so, Chair Moreno, I'll pause at this point and invite any questions or comments from committee members.
Thank you, Mr. Pimentel. Before we go into questions or comments, we're going to see if there's any public comment.
We have no public comments, Chair.
Thank you. Okay, yeah, that was a lot of information. Thank you so much, Mr. Pimentel. I will turn it over to the committee to see if any folks have any questions or comments. Do you see any? I absolutely do. Okay, thank you. Well, first and foremost, this is Vivian. Thank you so much for the presentation I think there was a ton to digest here. As we are, I mean, at least I'll speak for myself. I'm trying to figure out exactly how it is that we can get more funding for MTS, right? I think the bottom line that we've been hearing from the board and this committee is how do we generate new funding? One of my personal biggest focuses has been ridership, and how do we create more riders within our system? We have focused on the youth as potential riders for the future. But that's just, one focus. Obviously, the work that you're doing is tremendously important. Statewide, a lot to just wrap my brain around, but just in regards to size, who is the largest transit agency in the state of California, and where does MTS rank in regards to budget?
Yeah, so the largest agency in the state would be LA Metro, but it's followed very quickly by SFMTA and San Francisco Bay Area Rapid Transit District. That would be SF BART. You all find yourself within the top 5 agencies within the state of California. And so I do want to just pick up on one remark that you offered with regards to accessing new dollars for MTS specifically. Because you all find yourself on a more solid fiscal footing than other agencies in the state, one of the things we've been careful to include within our messaging on the need for operations funds is the need to also provide agencies with additional revenue to do precisely as you noted, grow ridership and further instill stability for the long term. And so there is going to be a balance of funds, to be clear, that would go out to agencies to address specifically their operating shortfalls, but also featured prominently within it would be funding that would be provided to agencies that are in positions like yours to be able to advance ridership growth, ridership retention strategies, whether that be things like increases in service levels, improvements to safety or cleanliness of your systems. For example, fare-free transit may be part of the mix. So really demonstrate that we as an industry are interested in making advances that allow us to have more mode share as a transportation player, but then also to that long-term operational and fiscal stability that the state and the public expect.
Thank you for that. And you could let this folks in San Francisco listen to me. You can let the folks in Sacramento know that we are running on a $56 million deficit, give or take. And it's really the CARES Act funding that's keeping us afloat. So we definitely are seeking funding. And we also have a really healthy CIP proposal, right, that we need to get implemented, especially when it comes, and I don't need to tell you this, but for the record, a lot of what we're doing is moving towards the direction that the state of California wants us to move in, right? So a lot of the changes that we are, a lot of the CIP programs that we do have going on is because of making California greener, as Sacramento and all of us want. So one of the things that I have noticed as a legislator is that there's a lot of focus on low income, unrepresented communities. A lot of funding is going in that direction. From your point of view, how can MTS be prepared to receive those funds? What information do we need to start gathering in order to make a case that we deserve the money down here?
So I would say that on those fronts, having a clear understanding of the communities that your lines serve, having a clear understanding of what your lines mean in terms of access to opportunity, whether that is education, places of employment, to other resources that folks need to access in just their daily lives, are going to be important for those narrative aspects of the various grant applications that will be available to, or I should say, grant opportunities that will be available to MTS in the coming years. You're right, there is this increased focus and attention within Sacramento, within the state's funding programs toward uplifting vulnerable communities, ensuring that investments are addressing past instances of harm or disservice to vulnerable communities. And so from a narrative sense, having that information in hand will certainly help you score well within these considerations. And I know, from having conversations with Ms. Cooney on this topic, when it comes to your ridership demographics and the profiles of your riders, that information is going to be continually critical in drawing down resources here at the state level.
Wonderful, thank you. Also, you had mentioned, and another question that I have is, how much is traditionally allocated to transit? How much of the California budget is allocated to transit agencies? And is it equal to some of the big states, big cities, big transit agencies in the federal government? That was a really bad question, but basically, what percentage of our budget goes to transit in the state of California? And do other states do the same? Do other states that have big metropolitan transit systems do the same thing or offer the same amounts? Or has the state of California left transit agencies behind?
So on this front, I'll note that I don't have the specific percentage in front of me, but I would note for you that it is well lower than what we've seen other states that have robust public transit systems within it. So, for example, we are behind, without a doubt, New York in the support that they provide to New York MTA. We are far behind Massachusetts in the support that's provided to MBTA. And so there is a process of reorientation that is taking place here in the state of California. It may not deliver necessarily, at least at this stage, funding that is commensurate with what some of those other large states with robust public transit provide. And that process is taking place under a policy that the Newsom administration had developed in 2020 that is being folded into its various programs. It's called the Climate Action Plan for Transportation Infrastructure. And what that is looking at specifically is that for the state's discretionary investments in particular, those have historically gone to traditional forms of transportation investment. And here I mean highways, local streets and roads, as well as bridge and just basic maintenance. There is an ability, though, that the state has to flex some of those dollars toward operations, toward capital purposes in public transit. And under CAPTI, there is a process of updating guidelines for various programs to better orient them toward advancing public transit, whether that means direct investment in public transit or in supportive infrastructure to support public transit. So a crystallized example for you here in San Diego would be for things like dedicated bus lanes on the state highway system, the ability to do bus on shoulder on the state highway system. Those are the types of things that are contemplated under CAPTI, and there is, again, this type of reorientation. Part of the conversation that we're looking to have within this conversation about operations funding and the more emergency needs that we have is a need for us to also establish a long-term path for agencies to receive ever more funding to allow us to have the service levels that will be necessary to actually bend the curve on ridership, to bring folks into our system and make sure that transit is a priority for Californians throughout the state.
Wonderful, thank you. And we've heard this from one of our board colleagues, Council Member Monica Montgomery Stepp. She's been championing the TDA reform for a long time now. So it's good to hear that there is a inclination in Sacramento to change just how we receive our funding. Also really good to hear about the discussion on fare box recovery. I think it's a discussion that we've been having as a board as well. I kind of scratch my head when I think about that they want us to improve transit operations. In order for us to receive funding, they want us to, quote, improve transit operations. So I'd be interested offline to hear a little bit more about that. And last, because I will not take up all the time, last but not least, in regards to AB 761, the Transit Transformation Task Force, I would love for MTS to have a seat at the table in regards to that task force. Mr. Pimentel, I don't have the demographics in front of us. I do represent our largest, most utilized trolley stop in the system, and that's the San Isidro trolley line. I know that the whole county of San Diego is 30% Latino. I would venture to say that our ridership is really highly leaning in the Latino direction. So it would be great to have representation on that task force, and also to tie it up, it would be great to see a person of color from Southern California as well. Oftentimes, I know me as a legislator, I represent the most southern part of the city. It's right along the border. We often get forgotten. And I will just say this, I think Sacramento often thinks that the state ends in LA. We don't. There's a lot of needs in San Diego. And so, we're an international city, if you will. We have the most cross-border of the world. And so it's very nice to close it up before I switch it to one of my colleagues here. It's very nice to hear from you. And your presentation was very informative. And I think it's more of a to be continued than see you, next year, because I know this would love to have you back to give us an update to see how Senator Wiener's bill is going and how we can assist you along the way with the connections we have here in San Diego. I'm sure you're very connected, but we have a few up our sleeves as well. I'm going to turn this over to the committee members. Anybody wishing? I see Councilmember Goebel on the lights. Go ahead.
Oh, I'll defer to Mr. Elo Rivero. I think had a comment first. Okay, a great question, Chair. Mr. Pimentel, this is Steve Goebel. Chair, great question on how does California's budget compare to other states? I might expect New York and Massachusetts to be higher because they were kind of built around transit. Chicago, New York, and they might have more money because of more usage. What would be an interesting metric, Mr. Pimentel, would be to say, what's California's dollars per 100,000 riders or something like that? And how does that compare to New York per 100,000 riders or something? In that way, you can gauge each state's allocation per rider, making it an even comparison instead of absolutes or percent of budgets. It helps normalize things, and that might be an interesting metric to gain.
I want all the money, though.
Thank you, Chair.
Council President Sean Elo Rivera.
Thank you, Chair. Sean here. So thank you for the presentation. Thanks for bringing this to us, Chair. A couple things that I'm curious about. One, if you can talk to us a little bit more about what traction there seems to be, kind of big picture with respect to flexibility to use transit capital funding for operations. I'm very curious about that.
Yeah, I would say the conversations are still fairly early, but I think the best indicator of the traction on that as a concept is the Senate's budget framework that was released yesterday. The specific call out that it has about providing operational funding support uses the words of flexibility within transportation investments. There they are contemplating using some of the transit capital dollars toward operations. I would also just signal that in previous years, I believe it was in 2020, we as an association had pursued flexibility to use one traditionally capital focused program for operations that would be the State Transit Assistance Stated Good Repair Program, as its name would suggest. Those monies were previously available to agencies for maintaining their systems in a state of good repair. Now, we had made the request at the time that we provide some flexibility in those dollars to allow agencies to orient those toward operations. That concept and the framework that we had built out for allowing agencies to access those capital dollars for operations is serving as the basis for our internal thinking and some of the conversations we've had with the legislature around how we could bring online additional flexibility in the use of transit capital for operations.
Got it. Thank you. I am very curious to see where that goes. I'm curious. One of the things that we seem to be leaning into quite a bit, and I don't know how it compares to other transit agencies, but our use of surplus lands to increase housing supply. And I'm curious to what extent, if at all, we're rewarded from a funding standpoint for leaning into what is a multi-pronged goal, a strategy to address multiple goals of the state with respect to increasing housing supply, reducing GHGs, et cetera.
Yeah, I would say directly within things like base level formula funds, the use of surplus lands for affordable or commercial development is not something that factors into the state's distribution of funds. However, within competitive grant opportunities, for example, the TIRCP, there is language within the guidelines and the criteria that are evaluated or used rather for evaluation of applications that calls out specifically pro-housing policies, pro-development policies that for the state demonstrate that as you are presenting what would be ridership gains from investments that the state is making, that they prove to be a bit more valid. And so there are criteria within programs like TIRCP that provide that type of award or that preference. I would be clear in noting that it doesn't specifically tie to the term of surplus lands as we think about it in state law and the processes that are dictated there, but is with that eye toward things like transit-oriented development. And in many cases, there is that nexus with surplus lands that agencies retain that they offload for these types of commercial or housing purposes.
Got it. Is that an opportunity perhaps in the future to try to explore, to reward and consequently, perhaps incentivize other places, but for us at least, kind of selfishly reward what we're already doing. From a formulaic, I'm glad that's there's grant opportunities that we can leverage from what we're already doing, but there would seem to be some real benefits from the formula adjusting in such a way that again rewards those of us who are kind of owning our responsibility with respect to housing, and what comes from transit oriented development and what's supposed to come from it, which is increased demand for transit use. It would seem that if that's what we're trying to incentivize, there should be resources that align with that incentivization.
I would say we've not pursued that specifically, but it is a point that is well taken. And without a doubt, as we are revamping things like the overarching law of TDA, there will be a number of things that are put on the table for improving that body of law, making it a bit more responsive to the nature of public transit today and some of the broader state goals and objectives. And that may be something that is featured within that discussion.
Okay, great. I just get like kind of even more big picture to the extent to which that, we are really thinking about the direction that we're heading as an agency and as a region, and then, leaning into the transit specific funding conversations in such a way that aligns with the direction we're already headed. And I have no doubt that we're already doing that to a certain extent, but the housing front seems to be one where San Diego, and just, specifically with what we're doing in the city of San Diego, would make us very competitive given the way that we are increasing housing, the ability to build housing near transit, and the way that MTS has literally made our land available for housing and is actually turning that availability into homes. I hope that is something that we can lean into in the future. Again, thank you, Chair, for bringing this conversation. Thank you, Mr. Pimentel, for the presentation. Very much appreciate it.
Thank you. Mayor McCann?
Thank you very much. Thank you for your presentation, Mr. Pimentel. This is John McCann from the mayor of the city of Chula Vista. And first, I wanted to thank the Chair Moreno talking about the funding for certain areas. She talked about how 30% of the city or the county of San Diego is Latino. I am, my city, Chula Vista, actually is 60%. And Chair Moreno talked about having the busiest trolley station in our system, but that's attached to the blue line, which is goes through Chula Vista, which is the busiest line we have and the most used. So I definitely think that there's opportunity for us to look at that in most of these trolley areas and trolley lines. I think it meets the equivalence of what the state is trying to look at for people who are more working class, and specifically the target that they want to improve and help and hopefully fund additional transit. I also want to thank Council President Sean Elo Rivera. I think he brought up a very good point about housing. At the city of Chula Vista, we also have a project on our one of our MTS sites. It's the quintessential smart growth strategy, where you are bringing and creating an urban core around mass transit. You're building housing, you're building a medical center literally on a trolley stop, so that residents who live there are able to immediately, when they go to work, be able to use the trolley system. Or if people work at the medical center that will be built there, to be able to use the trolley system to be able to go to work. And so I would, again, just support the council presidents, Elo Rivera, on how can we push and make Sacramento look at providing incentives. I believe that the city of San Diego, the city of Chula Vista, we are doing the proper smart growth, urban core land use that the state does want to do. And I think we should look for opportunities to be able to reward that. If we are doing the right thing, I hope that Sacramento would be able to give us additional funding to be able to fund our transit system, because we are creating housing specifically in those areas because of the good transit. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you. One of the things, if I may add, I think a few follow-ups is 5 billion in the next 5 years for all transit agencies throughout the state. That's a really big number to kind of grasp. So if you don't mind, Mr. Pimentel, in the future, letting us know how much would MTS get every single year based on Mr. Wiener's bill? That's one. And then also, if you could please keep us updated on the changes that are being proposed. I know when bills come out, there are a lot of legislators that want to, how could I put this? Make sure earmark funding, right, for their specific area. And if there are ways that you would suggest that we would potentially want to make any changes to get more money for MTS. But thank you for the presentation. I think there's a lot, not a lot, but there is some legwork for MTS for us. I'd love to see the demographics of our ridership. I don't know if we have that. I don't know how we get that. We do. Okay, wonderful. I think that would be a great thing. And also, I would be remiss if I didn't thank Sharon for bringing Mr. Pimentel. I think it was your idea. So I can't take the credit for that, you guys. But Mr. Pimentel, thank you so much. We really appreciate your advocacy for MTS at the state level, and we'll continue to work together closely. Thank you.
I appreciate the opportunity to be before you today and looking forward to that next opportunity. Thank you.
Thanks. Okay, so we are going to move on to item number 5, which is the fiscal year 2024 proposed operating budget. We have Mr. Thompson here. And Mr. Thompson, please let us know. I actually say that at council. I mean at committee. Take it away.
Good afternoon. I'm here to present the proposed fiscal year 24 operating budget. It was included as attachment A, the entire budget book. So today we're going to present some updates on the assumptions in the budget and also any changes that since the last draft we presented to you last month. So starting with our passenger levels, we do have March's official results, well, preliminary results for March, actually. We're waiting on Charlie still. And we have this chart that we've been using for the last couple of years. It shows these blue bars as our pre-COVID baseline, and then the green bars are the actual riders that we've had each month. And these percentages is the relation between those two. And you can see in July of 21, we were down in the 50s, and we're all the way into the 80s now. And even though March was at 79%, it did dip a little bit in March, primarily due to all the rain that we had that month. It does damper ridership substantially when it rains. So we missed what our original projection was for March from the mid-year budget slightly because we dropped down here, but April is already back in this 83% range. So we fully expect that our trend is still continuing to go up in this area. And if you look year over year, even though January and March were very, very rainy this year, we were about 80% of baseline in 23 compared to only 66% in fiscal year 22. We have had substantial growth. We're sort of using that continuous steady growth that we've had for about the last 2 years and use that as the assumption for next fiscal year still. So we forecasted 11% growth at the last meeting. We're not changing that. We are using that same 81 million passengers for next year into this budget. So passenger revenue is the same story. We do have March's results. It was slightly below the mid-year budget. We missed it by about $500,000 compared to what we presented to in that amended budget. So you can see the chart here. This orange is our forecast. This purple was the amended budget, and the green line in the middle here is what we assumed for fiscal year 24. It is that same 11% growth that we presented to you last month. Even though we missed this 1 month, we expect to get back on track and probably still hit our amended budget of $70.9 million at this point in time. So we're not changing our assumption on this line as well, even though March was a little bit below expectations, because we do think it was just short term because of the rain. Looking at other revenue adjustments, we did make some changes to the revenue budget in other operating revenue. We've increased that overall assumption by $2 million. Majority of that is in our energy credit revenues. So we presented this chart to you when we talked about the mid-year budget of the state LCFS prices and the federal RIN prices. So the blue line here is the state prices, and that had dropped down dramatically as we talked about, and we lowered our mid-year assumption to $70 per credit for when we sell these credits. So over the last 2 weeks, we've seen that number start to climb up. It actually peaked at about 85 at the end of last week and early this week, and it was 80 as of yesterday. So since we'd assumed 70 over the course of all of next year in their last draft, we decided that's probably being overly conservative. So we started sort of growing this back through the next fiscal year, starting at 85 in July and sort of growing slowly from there over the course of the year to average it out to 93 for the year versus 70 in the original assumption, which generates a lot more revenue. That alone is about $1.6 million increase in revenue. And we're only getting up to about 100 by the end of the next fiscal year. We also have some guidance on these state credits from California Air Resources Board, and they project it to be much higher than that by the July of next year. So we're sort of using that and not going as high as they're projecting, but definitely not being as conservative and keeping it at $70 next fiscal year and putting a more realistic average figure of $93. On the federal side, that's the red line here. We updated the last couple of months here. We're still trending about $2. It's not changing substantially. We don't have any sort of external guidance on where this could go. So we just sort of kept that assumption in place and didn't change it as of this point in time. We also increased our real estate related revenues by about $300,000. As we did our final reviews, we thought that number was a little bit light and we kept that number more in line with current fiscal year. So in total, you can see we're projecting about $2.8 million increase in this line, which is $2 million higher than the last draft. So this next slide looks at the proposed revenue budgets. $103.6 million in operating revenues. That's our increase for passenger revenue is the $8 million. And then the updated other operating revenue assumption is an increase of $2.8 million. So that's increasing by almost 11.7%. And then the subsidy revenues, there's no changes to these assumptions from what we presented last month. We're projecting $252.2 million of subsidy revenue. That's $1.7 million higher than the current amended budget. And then we have some growth there on the sales tax side, but we also have some additional needs on the capital side that was funded there for the swap for federal and TDA. And then we do have Transnet growth, but we're also losing some fast track revenue that's offsetting that. So again, just about $1.7 million increase there. So in total, we have 3.7% growth in revenue projected for next fiscal year, $12.7 million of revenue growth. Moving on to our expense assumption changes, and we did do some energy assumption changes, and we wanted to bring more details around that back to the committee. Starting with electricity, and electricity is really two major components. It's the transmission and demand that we pay to SDG&E, and that's also the actual commodity. The transmission demand for SDG&E is these blue bars, and this is the cost per kilowatt hour. It's 5 years of actual, the current year amended budget, and the proposed FY24 budget. And it's just steadily going up and up and up and up. And it's about 2/3 of the total cost, depending on the year. And there's really nothing we can do about those costs. So we generally assume a 10% increase every year. And unfortunately, we come in very close to that every year. So we've kept that assumption the same. On the commodity side, you can see that's the red bars here. We are typically in the 5 to 7, 8 cent range on the commodity. And then FY22, when CNG first started to climb due to the war in Ukraine, we paid almost 10 cents. We're on track to pay over 14 the current fiscal year. So as of right now, we do a couple of different forecasts of what we think the cost should be. And then we also get a price from our external vendors of what a fixed cost would be. So we're projecting 12.8 cents per kilowatt hour next year for the commodity. That's this red bar. So even our projections, that builds in a lot of the uncertainty from this last year into next year's number. Because 12.8 cents is a ridiculously high number if we had never had FY23. It's a very high, we are normally in the 5 to 7 cent range. So that number just even now feels high, even though we had a very poor winter. The fixed price would be a little bit higher than that. So we'd have to increase the budget by about a few $100,000 if we wanted to lock in that price. But then we would have budget certainty. We would pay that exact price. And we can lock in either that total volume or even partial volumes or even certain periods of the year. We can work with that with our direct access vendor. As of right now, we are not recommending that fixed position. It just seems it's only a little bit savings over FY23, and FY23 is supposed to be a giant anomaly. It just doesn't feel like a prudent decision to lock in at that rate. So we will continue to monitor that, and if the pricing does look more favorable, we will bring it back to the committee. Same sort of view on the natural gas side. There's actually 3 components, major components on the natural gas side. Again, we do pay SDG&E for a large portion of this for transportation of the actual gas, and then some taxes around that, and also the station electricity costs are through SDG&E. And we have station maintenance costs. We have a vendor called Trillium that manages that for us. We have a contract in place that fixes those prices for the next few years. And then the third piece is the natural gas commodity. Again, we pay index rates through a third party for this as well, like with electricity. So same story here. The blue bars are SDG&E. It just goes up and up and up and up. So it's not growing as fast on this side as on the electricity side. So we only assume 7% growth there for next year, but it doesn't not go up. So, and we have no control over that piece. So we built that assumption in. The station maintenance costs, we recently rebid this out, and in FY 23, you can see that number dropped a little bit compared to the previous number, which is close to $2 a decatherm, now about $1 a decatherm. So that number is fixed in place for a number of years going forward. And then the natural gas commodity is these green bars. Again, we had very steady costs for gas, like electricity, between $2 and $4 a decatherm. FY 22, it shot up to over $6 a decatherm. And then FY 23 with the problems in January, February, and March, December, January, and February. And those high prices, we're paying over $13 a decatherm on average for the year because of those spikes that we talked about at the mid-year budget. So as of right now, staff is projecting about $6 a decatherm, which again is a very high number when you look at the history, and the history goes back even farther than this. $6 a decatherm is a high number. Nationally, we're a little bit above $2 a decatherm right now, but there still is the pipeline situations into Southern California, as well as the storage situation in Southern California that is driving up the overall price a lot higher than we would see nationally. We did get a fixed price from our vendor last week. It was $7.44 per decatherm. So we would need to add about $1.5 million to the budget to lock in that at that price. Again, we feel it's building in a lot of uncertainty of what happened this last winter into next year's, fixed prices. So we're not recommending a fixed position especially at $7.44. We'll continue to monitor that and see if it comes any lower and just see how the fundamentals change as well. But it really is a Southern California issue right now and the future. So with those assumption changes, we did change energy in total by about $175,000 increase. We actually lowered our natural gas cost projection and we increased our electricity projection. And then we also had a net increase of about $160,000 on the personnel side. Part of that was the addition of 2 IT positions into the budget. And then we are projecting now 1,701 full-time equivalents in the budget book for that position table. There were no other expense changes. We didn't make any other assumption changes on the expense side. So in total, it increased by about $400,000. We're at $26.6 million increase in expenses. Personnel is increasing by about $9 million. Again, that is increased service levels as part of that. And it's also wage increases as well as some healthcare increases. Purchase transportation is increasing by about $14 million. That is also partially service related. And also then the rest is rate related. Outside service is increasing by $6.3 million. Energy, you can see in total is dropping by $4.5 million, even though we still have some very high assumptions in there compared to historical norms. And risk management is also increasing by $1.3 million due to higher liability insurance costs. So when you roll things up, we have $12.6 million of revenue growth, but $26.6 million of expense growth. So we are increasing our operating deficit, going from $37 million to just over $51 million. And we will continue to balance that with stimulus funding. We also continue to draw as much stimulus funding as possible and put excess stimulus funding into a reserve for future use. So we also updated our 5-year projection. We used the new starting point as this proposed FY24 budget and sort of reran all the projections we presented to the last month. Some of the major assumptions here is we do continue to have passenger revenue growth towards our pre-pandemic norms. We are not projecting to get back to our pre-pandemic norm in this 5-year period, but we are assuming that ridership will continue to come back slow and steady over this 5-year period. We're also assuming sort of higher growth in our other operating revenues, partially due to energy credit growth, but also just the price growth there. And then also partially due to new initiatives like the Gaslamp Order Digital Information Board. Things like that are assumed in the out years to bolster our other operating revenue. We're assuming federal revenue is stable in the operating budget, no major changes there, just slight growth with as preventive maintenance costs grow. And then our sales tax revenue assumptions, these are projected by SANDAG, affecting both TDA and Transnet. So their average growth is about 3% per year over the next 4 years for those revenue sources. That's all built in. We are assuming no additional service growth. In FY24, we do have anticipated service changes in January of next year. So we'll just keep that level constant from there out. So it does have a little bit of growth in FY25 as you have a full year of those numbers. But other than that, we're not projecting any additional services being added in this 5-year period. We are also projecting ADA paratransit demand to grow over this period as well, as we are still well below our pre-pandemic levels on that service level. And since it's so expensive, we are building those assumptions in there as well. On the expense side, you can see we're assuming higher levels of CPI in 25 and 26 before getting back to our more normal level of around 3% in the out years. Wages and benefits, similarly, we're projecting higher levels the first couple of years before getting back to normal. And then purchase transportation, this is the contracted rates in place for both TransDev and for First Transit for the next 4 years. And on the energy side, we do expect to have additional savings, like we're having savings in FY24 versus 23. The commodity costs are still very high in 24. So we do expect some savings there in the out years, but at the same time, most of the costs don't go to the commodity on the energy side. It goes to SDG&E, and those costs continue to go up. So there's only partial savings in that line and built into the forecast. So when you do all the math, this is what it projects out to be. We start with our $51 million deficit in current fiscal year. We grow to about $57 million next year as we have additional service in that year, as well as not as much revenue growth as expense growth that year. And then similar, just go, the deficit continues to grow in the out years as revenue growth is not keeping pace with projected expense growth. So as of now, we are projecting to have some sort of stimulus funding available into FY27, similar to what we presented to you last month. And at that point in time, we will have the fiscal cliff that we've been talking about. Wanted to give the board an update on our contingency reserve balance. Again, the policy is that there be a 12.5% target for our 12.5% of our operating budget be a target for our contingency reserve. So that target based on this draft budget would be $44.9 million. At the end of last year's audit in FY22, we had $41.8 million. So we're $3 million under that target. We will not utilize this reserve this year or next. So right now we're projecting about 11.6 versus the target of 12.5. We're not proposing to make any adjustments to that. We're proposing to monitor that as we get through the fiscal year 23 end, see what those results look like. And if we're still below that target, maybe look at doing something with that at mid-year amendment. But again, we're not planning on using this at all. Lastly, we wanted to talk about just the major initiatives on the plate of the agency as of for fiscal year 24. Top of mind should be addressing the structural deficit and balancing our recurring expenses to our recurring revenue streams. We will stretch those stimulus dollars as long as possible, but we do have an issue starting in fiscal year 27 based on our latest projections. As we talked about the last board meeting, we do have significant capital needs over the next 5 years. We continue to work on ridership and build up revenue on the ridership side. Looking at tapping to get more people tapping on trolley as well. We have the results of the social equity liquidity tour and everything that's going to bring with it. We do have money set aside for that, but there's going to be a number of projects around that that will be the agency will focus on. And then we are continuing our zero emission bus implementation. We have actively building it out at South Bay Division. We're in process of funding everything for Imperial Avenue Division, and we just got awarded some transit intercity rail capital program funding for our Kearney Mesa Division to build out that construction. So that's $50 million that was awarded to us earlier this week that sort of helps our capital program as well. So with that, brings you to the staff recommendation. The recommendations at the Budget Development Committee forward a recommendation to the MTS Board of Directors to receive testimony, review, and comment on the fiscal year 24 MTS operating budget at a public hearing to be scheduled on May 18th, 2023, and enact Resolution 23-4, which was attachment B, adopting the fiscal year 24 operating budget for MTS, San Diego Transit Corporation, San Diego Trolley, MTS Contract Services, and the Coronado Ferry.
Thank you for the presentation, Mike. Clerk, are there any members of the public wishing to comment on item number 5?
We have no public comments.
Okay, thank you. We're going to move on to comments from committee members. Please remember, this is an action item, so we will need a motion and a second. Are there any members of the committee wishing to make any comments at this time? Councilmember Goebel?
Thank you, Chair. On the real estate side, all of our transit-oriented development are ground leases to the developers where we haven't actually sold those properties. We still get income from ground leases. And I'm going to, as we complete projects, does that income increase, such as Grantville?
So this is Sharon Cooney, CEO. All of them are ground leases. And so in some of them, we are getting a little bit of money from the developer as the units start leasing. So for instance, out at Grossmont, we have income annually of 300,000 a year.
Oh, so it's nothing material, really.
Well, I don't know.
Compared to a $400 million budget. I don't mean to discount 300,000,
No, I know what you're saying.
300,000.
But more recently, we've been sort of subsidizing the affordability factor by lowering the ground leases to accommodate the fact that they
Thank you.
need that.
The ridership assumes an 11% growth. Is that, or actually the revenue of $8 million is an 11% growth in revenue. Is that from new riders? Is that from greater enforcement of fare box recovery of existing riders? Was that a blend, or can you tell me more about?
Again, this is Sharon. It's mostly from increased riders.
It's not,
Expectations.
it's basically ridership returning to the system is how we look at it. And we have a baseline of a much higher level of ridership on our system at existing service levels. And we're waiting for that to come back all the way. So we're planning on that to continue to come back like it has been. So it's 11% increase in ridership, 11% increase in revenue, no real change in average fare.
Okay. And do we have 100% return to the routes pre-pandemic? I understand ridership is not there yet, and we've had a driver shortage. Does that mean we're not at 100% pre-pandemic routes, or are we there?
We are not there yet. We will pretty much be there by January of next year. When we get those service back at pretty much pre-pandemic levels is what that assumption is. But we do have less service now than we did a year ago, and we have ridership growing.
Okay, that's good news. Thank you for the fixed energy cost analysis. That's very insightful because I think we spent about $5 million more than we thought this year on the natural gas. And if I understand, we would spend about $2.5 million to lock in electric and natural gas. I agree with you. I don't think it's worth the effort. I think we go on that one. The thing that this doesn't include is Senator Wiener's potential budget thing. We may not face a fiscal cliff in FY27 if Senator Wiener's budget comes through and takes care of a lot of that. We may stretch out our ARPA funds a lot longer than just FY27 if we get this new Senate bill. And I think would be helpful to have a comparison of the percentages of fare box recovery over the years, because we're anticipating $26 million more in expenses next year than we are this year. And we haven't raised fares in a long time. At some point, we have to raise fares, especially if we haven't done it 5 or 7 years. However, I agree with those who have said it's not fair to raise fares until we have a fare enforcement program. Otherwise, the fares are on the back of those who are paying their way versus those who aren't. So those two kind of go hand in hand, the enforcement and the fare increase. But I just I have a trouble seeing how year after year we have $26 million increase expenses and our passengers aren't bearing some of that expense. I think there's some value in what you have to pay for. So I think that's probably long-term discussion. Fare box recovery percentage is probably one way to look at that. That would be my suggestion, that we perhaps have a presentation on that to the board at a future date. Thank you.
Thank you, Council President Sean Elo.
Thank you, Chair. Did you make a motion? Okay, all right. I'll start by moving the staff recommendation for this, Chair.
Second.
Thank you. I will, no surprise, just really interested in continuing to see how we can grow revenue. I'm looking at the major initiatives for 2024, balancing recurring expenses to recurring revenue streams. You know, that can mean a multitude of things, right? That can mean, reduction on the expense side, that can mean increasing on the revenue side, that can mean a combination of both. I just really want to make sure that we've been as creative and aggressive as possible in terms of thinking about expanding revenue opportunities before we lean into the reduction of service side. Chair, you talked a lot in 2021 about your fears around the death spiral, right? Which, it sounds like dramatic language, but it's real. And I think that we're in a moment, especially as we are doing what Mayor McCann and I mentioned in the last item, leaning into transit-oriented development, and where we need transit to work. And knowing that we need transit to work means that we need to really invest in transit, and some of that, no doubt, should come through the ways that federal and state governments fund our transit systems. But I also think it's incumbent upon us to be as creative as possible about exploring revenue opportunities. And as in many situations, I hope that in doing so, we can lean into the assets that we have as a region, being a major tourist destination, to figure out how we leverage that to the benefit of the residents of San Diego. And I think that there are opportunities there. But we live in a beautiful place that folks come to and visit, that they want to get around and see San Diego. And there are for-profit entities that leverage the beauty of the region, the culture of the region, for profit in moving people around. And I hope that we can explore how a public transit agency might be able to leverage that in a way that brings in revenue that can be then cycled back into the system and provide reasonable, low-cost opportunities for the folks who live here and serve those tourists to get to and from work and the other things that they need to do in life. So I know that I've been beating that drum consistently. I think it's so important. And what excites me about that is I think that San Diego can be a leader on that front and demonstrate a different way for making public transportation work for the people who it needs to work for. And not to make this a philosophical or ideological debate, Mr. Goebel, but I think the question that we ask about, folks paying their fair share, the outrage that folks felt when we had that conversation about driving is never expressed when we have it about transit riders, the folks who need it. And that tilting that balance to have a more honest conversation about the costs of public transportation and the benefits versus the costs of driving and its downsides, it's a major conversation that's going to take years for us to suss out. But I certainly want to ensure that here at MTS, we are doing everything possible to expand service to provide those who most need and depend on transit, the dependable quality services that they deserve, and that we don't just simply give in to the kind of long perpetuated narrative that public transportation is a big subsidy for folks, and we always need to be thinking about cutting costs. Because I think that's part of why we are where we are in terms of the big structural system that we live in at the federal and state levels. Anyway, that was a lot of ideological and theoretical stuff. I'll get off the soapbox. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. I don't see anybody else on the mic, so I want to thank my colleagues for your comments. First off, thanks, Mike, and our financial staff for taking a deep dive into the energy cost component of our budget. I found those slides to be very illuminating, so thank you for that. Also, I think there's some encouraging news about ridership in the presentation. Our ridership this year between January and March averaged 80%. Compared to just 66% last year during the same period. And this occurred despite a historically rainy winter for San Diego, right? So I think we're definitely on the right track. And as was mentioned, if the state steps into what we're hoping they do, which is support over the next 5 years, I believe our near-term financial outlook is going to be very strong. So assuming that this aid materializes, we will have the space to continue investing in future ridership growth as much as we possibly can. I think MTS must focus like a laser on improving ridership. I think every transit agency must continue to evolve or else they're going to die. And I don't think MTS is any different. So I think we must embrace changes and also innovation, right? In order for us to survive. I will point out that this is our last meet. Well, we don't have a date for a next budget meeting. Traditionally, it has been our last meeting. So these discussions, unless we have a budget committee, meeting, these discussions will have to happen at the board level. And obviously we could look into how one of the things we've discussed in the last 4 months is what's going to be the next step, right? Are we going to wait and see if the state gives us funding? We got an update on that. Are we going to look at a proposed ballot initiative? I don't know. Does it come out of here? Does it come out of the board? I'm not certain. And or are we gonna raise the fee of our tickets, which for the record, I'm completely opposed to, but I recognize my position as chair. I have to be open to letting anybody discuss what they like. Those discussions right now are going to be had at the board unless we would like to have some of those discussions more in depth at the committee level. So with that concludes my comments, but thank you to the staff. I truly appreciate you guys always giving us just really in-depth information and letting us know where we are, right? Which is a little daunting, but it's the truth. So that's where we are. So we do have a motion by Council President Elo Rivera, second by Mayor McCann. And so with that, Council President Elo Rivera, we could have a voice vote.
Yes.
Councilmember Goebel,
Yes.
Councilmember McCann,
Yes.
and Councilmember Vivian Moreno is a yes. So that motion carries unanimously with interim chair Whipron absent. I would like for our CEO to give us a quick update on some developing news, right, in the past few days. So I'm going to pass it over to CEO Sharon Cooney.
Yeah, and I just wanted to, before I get into that, I did want to echo that in the event that there is something budgetary that is pressing before we do our normal budgetary cycle next winter, we will certainly call this committee back in with the chair's permission. The other thing is sometimes the board might want to refer a topic of conversation to this committee. So we could always put it on an agenda for a future meeting as well. Just so everybody has, if you haven't seen the news, we are in a work stoppage situation at 2 of our bus divisions. Actually, yesterday we were at 2, today we were only at 1. Today, the South Bay had full coverage of its service, and there was no picketing at that location. But there was still a work stoppage it's a sympathetic work stoppage at the Copley Park Kearney Mesa Division, which is where we operate out the paratransit routes as well as the minibus services that service some of our communities. We don't know where that's going to go tomorrow. But we were pleased to be able to serve our customers again today at least on the main fixed routes. On the paratransit side, we have been able to leverage our relationships with Yellow Cab and users and some others to try to get the really essential paratransit trips done. So that's where we're at with that. We'll wait and see how that goes tomorrow, but we do understand our contractor, who is actually the one negotiating with the unions, is still in conversations with them.
Wonderful. Thank you for that update. And we are going to move on to item number 6, which is the next meeting date. Our next meeting is to be determined. So I will move over to item number 8, which is adjournment. Thank you all for your input today, and the meeting of the MTS Budget Development Committee is now officially adjourned. And have a wonderful day, you guys.